I came to film through architectural teaching, right? So my kind of course we are exposed to film socially in different ways, but the kind of thinking of film or understanding of film or analyzing film first began through an architectural lens. That's how I learned about film. So for me, teaching film comes quite naturally because that's how I learned about film in the first place. I didn't go to film school first. I went to architecture school first, and it was in the AA where I was studying that I became exposed to different types of films, to filmmaking, to filmmakers. So film and teaching have always happened within that realm, within that space. I then afterwards went to film school, but that's another discussion. So then to your question of why should what is it about film that architects should learn or should know about? I think that film is a medium that allows you to think about architecture in a very specific way, which is different to thinking about architecture through writing, which is different to thinking about architecture through photography, which is different to thinking about architecture through drawing, etc. And the way that we learn architecture or learn about architecture in the academic environment is through those different mediums: drawing, writing, photography, and so on. And then film is just another way of looking at architecture. One thing that's particularly interesting to me is that film is, I believe, naturally spatial. You have to be aware of space in order to work with film or to think through film. So then there's, a connection there with architecture, which is very, very close. So it gives the architects the opportunity to look at their discipline, look at how they work, how others work, look at their sites, look at the environment through a particular lens. So when you do drawings, you learn about your environment, about space in a particular way, and your inquiry is related to that way of thinking with a hand, with a pen, with a pencil, whatever it might be, with a computer.
Or this notion of slicing. In a way, in a drawing, you're always slicing the building.
Yes, in architectural drawing, yes.
Because it's something that no one really, it's an experience of a building that no one will ever have. But it's interesting that film, maybe it's almost a bit slightly more transcendental because we all know this medium and we know that it relates to reality somehow.
Yeah, so when we take photographs or when we make a film, we are looking at architecture differently than when we would with our own eyes. We're framing it in a different way. We are formatting it in a different way. So you can't say that film is just like watching the reality. Is that it goes through a process of change the moment that you include the medium. I think that film offers architects just a different way of looking at their discipline, essentially. Yeah.
But if you go again, because we start with education, maybe I think we're going to talk more about how film constructs space or has an ability to probably make space or imagine space. But maybe before we get there, I think what's really interesting what you say is that you learned film through architectural education. And therefore, my first instinct is to ask you, what did you learn, or how did you learn through architectural education, or what are the films that were your window into the world of film in relation to architecture?
So one of the first films that I saw in architecture school was Sunless, Sans Soleil by Chris Marker. I had never seen this film before. I'd never been exposed to essay filmmaking before. You know, my filmic knowledge was actually very narrow at that point. I think it was in the second, was it the first year of architecture or second year? I can't remember. It was at the early part of my career. And it was...
And that's before Pascal Schoening.
Yes, way before Pascal. And so we were watching that film in relationship to the different environments that were being portrayed in the film: Tokyo, West Africa, Paris. You know, these different sites that the traveller goes to and writes back about. But for me, it was suddenly a different way of looking at cities, at landscapes, and the relationship between people in those landscapes and cities. So if I don't know, if I had seen that film in a different context, it might have been introduced to me in a different way. But, you know, we might have spoken more about the form of the film, you know, and the techniques and so on. But those things were not so relevant in terms of the discussion that we were having in the studio. It was more to do about, you know, the human and the environment and the idea of, you know, different cultures being seen through one lens. And so that was the first film that I saw. And then it gets very blurry after that as to, you know, other films that...
So you already had interest in film as a tool within the kind of architectural field before you started?
Not really. I was always interested in photography. Mm-hmm. I really loved taking
photos. But with Pascal, did you start to see film as a tool in the architectural discourse before you studied with Pascal?
Yes. So I couldn't conceptualize those things at that time. I was interested in architecture. I didn't really know why I was interested in architecture, first of all. I was just really interested in the power of space and how it can impact a person, and thinking about extraordinary spaces and the effect they have on us as people. That's really kind of very basic idea of why I was interested in architecture. I then realized that through taking photographs, I could capture some of that sensation. So photography became very important to me. And my first drawings were kind of more like collages using photography and drawing, and as a way of trying to create a sense of atmosphere. And film just became a natural progression. You know, once I saw films like Saint-Soleil and so on, I realized, okay, that sense of atmosphere, spatiality, emotion in space is something that happens in film. So, I began with photography and then moved on to film. By the time I got to Pascal, I'd already made small films and so on, you know. But it was only once I was with him that I really tried to develop that language much more.
And he had do you think he had a very unique perspective? There were certain schools of thought that he was attached to, like very Godard, or there was a kind of a modernist sensibility in some way.
I think so. To be honest, it was very interesting. We didn't speak so much about films in the studio. We would watch a film, and that would become a kind of guiding force for the year. The film that we watched
for the whole year.
Yeah, so he was interested in this film called Beyond. Was it called Beyond the Clouds, which Antonioni and Wim Wenders made together.
Okay.
And we watched that, and we spent a lot of time just looking at the different scenes, the different moments. I mean, he loved Antonioni and he loved Wim Wenders. He loved both those directors. But we didn't spend so much time talking about film and filmmakers. he was more interested in the role of memory, in the way that we remember, in the way that we think about space, in the way that we project space. And he was interested in architecture which was non-material, that could be projected through memory. So it's very abstract, really. I mean, my memory is very bad too, so I'm maybe not a very reliable source. But it was a given, if you entered into his studio, that you would make films. So it was never like a question, you should make a film, or you should look at it. It was more just, yeah, that's how you work. It could also be photography if you wanted to. There was no there was never like a set brief, you have to do this or you have to do that. It was every session, we met twice a week, was just a group session. We sat together and we talked about ideas. Maybe we showed a bit of film, maybe we did, a bit of, sometimes people just read text, or, it was very, very open.
But then you would have developed your own palette of maybe references?
I guess so. That year I was very interested in Wim Wenders, his documentaries. So Tokyo Story was a reference, and in fact some of those bits ended up in my own film. But it was more just about being able to tell a particular story through photography and film. But there were some of my colleagues didn't make any films, so it really depended. Some people produced books. They had a book, and that's what.
And you're talking about
Pascal
Schoen's Diploma 3 at the AA.
So it depended from person to person what you wanted to do. I honestly never thought that I didn't think my films were very good. I just never thought I could do it seriously until the films that I made with Pascal were selected for the Royal Academy for the summer shows. It was the first year that they had the architecture part, and I was encouraged by the then chairman Moyson to submit my films to this, and they selected it, and I was completely taken aback to see films within an architectural context. For me it was a very abstract idea that could happen, and once that happened very publicly, and and it was out in the world, I realized, oh, okay, you can make films about architecture and people will watch it and be interested.
But do you draw this line between you as an architect and you as a filmmaker? Where is that line?
For a very long time I did, because they were very different practices. So I finished studying at the AA, and then I worked in practice, for different practices until I got my Part 3, and then I kind of set up my own studio. But for about 8-10 years, I was just working for different people, doing projects. Whilst
continuing to build on your interest in
film.
film.
While I was still teaching. So, I was teaching and looking at photography, looking at filmmaking, and then eventually doing more and more filmmaking with the students. This became easier just because of technology. Suddenly phones could make films, but this didn't happen till, I can't remember now exactly the year, but for a long time you had to have a video camera, and you had to have editing equipment, and you had to have all these things. So it wasn't so easy to do filmmaking within an educational context. But as it became easier, we started to use it more and more and more. So that's, and then at one point I started to see the crossover a little bit more. What happened is that I worked in practice for many years, and then I went to film school because I wanted to, still seeing the things as being very separate, I wanted to improve. I wanted to do it professionally. I was making films on my own with my camera and whatever, but I thought, I want to improve this, I want to get better technically. So I went to film school, and I learnt all those things: sound recording, camera, whatever,
So technical things. But how did you find film school? I'm actually starting to be quite interested in film schools because I'm doing this program at the AA this summer for the first time, and I'm talking to a few people that teach in film schools, and it looks like there is a different ecosystem in those places, and I wonder whether, like, some of them are really quite impressed with the work, the discourse that exists in architecture schools on film, and I don't know if maybe the discourse is maybe more technical in film schools and less.
It depends on the film school. The film school I went to, the London Film School, also I went there a long time ago, maybe that's also changed. There was no discourse. Or the kind of discourse that we had was, we would look at, there'd be like a lecture series on John Ford's Westerns. It was very much in the fictional world, and it was very much maybe based in Hollywood, based in America. There wasn't that much, some European stuff, but certainly not Godard, for instance. He was never discussed. That had a lot to do with the people who were teaching there and what kind of films they liked. And also they were looking at fiction, they were looking at horror, they were looking at comedy, they're looking at,
musical and Western.
That's right.
Yeah.
So they're looking at very particular genres which are not necessarily very intellectualized. I mean, depends how you discuss it. They could be.
Yeah.
But in the context of the school, it was just about how do you write a script which has acting. Acting is a big
But you still
thing.
found that very useful.
I absolutely loved it, because I already had my kind of conceptual base and what I wanted to do. I knew what I wanted to do. I just didn't know I wanted to get better at doing it. So I had never worked with actors, for instance, so working with actors, writing a script. So for 3-4 years, I went totally towards the fictional side. I did nothing to do with documentaries, and just working on developing a narrative fictionally.
It is hard. I mean, actors is the hardest thing, and you just asked our students to act, and actually it's. It is very difficult.
It is very difficult, and in my experience taught very badly also in film schools.
Mm-hmm.
It has a lot to do with experience and practice. And so Mike Lee was the chairman of the London Film School, and he would often come to crits and so on, and he was always very tough on us, saying, it's just terrible acting, And there was not enough teaching at the time. I mean, this is maybe very specific to my time, about how to work with actors and how to, develop a scene with an actor, how to rehearse it, all those things.
Or how to film it. I mean, an actor might be good, but maybe you're not filming it in a way that, or you're not recording it in a way that.
So that is quite technical, you see.
Yeah.
So that we were taught a little bit,
This is when things get a bit more, I guess, complex. But what I think it's interesting that you say is that you almost had something in your hands.
Yeah, and also just practice.
Mm-hmm.
Being able, so one of the things we did at film school is make lots and lots of films and work with a lot of other students making lots. So it's just practice at doing things and getting them wrong. And So my first films when I came out of film school were short fictions, working with actors, which happened all to be non-actors, but that's a different story. Because I wanted to explore that, and I wanted to get better at it, and kind of test all the things that I'd learned in film school. And then later on, I came back to documentary. But my documentaries have bits of fiction in them, so I still use
So do you see Bawa's Garden, which is your latest or one of your latest films? Do you see? Is that a documentary or is that a fiction?
I think it's an essay.
Mm-hmm.
It's an architectural film essay. That's how I would say it. I call them documentaries because I have to call them something so that people know where to put them. And it's up to people to make up their mind whether they think it's a documentary. I mean, everything that happens in those films is real. It might not have happened in that moment, but it did happen at some time. So they're kind of reenactments of things that have happened to me, let's say. So you could, I mean, this is another discussion, what is fiction, what is real, all that kind of stuff. I don't really, it doesn't bother me whether it's a fiction or a documentary.
I mean, so much on documentaries nowadays are actually, so much of nature documentaries are actually CGIs and...
Correct. I mean, there's a quote that I always talk about, kind of present to my students from Jacques Rancière, which says the real needs to be fictionalized in order to be understood. And that's how I see it, that I'm dealing with the real, real histories, real places, real people. But
does that say something about us, that we are so in tune with this medium that we need reality to be almost translated for us to be able to really engage with it?
Possibly. For me, it's just more fun, to be honest. Just shooting what is there is just not that interesting to me. It's about how do I tell the right story about, let's say, an architect or a building. And in order to tell the right story according to how I understand it, I sometimes have to use fictional elements. That's all it is, really.
So in Bawa's garden, you said that you've been to Sri Lanka many times, and in some way it's a story of your discovery of Geoffrey Bawa. How did you end up in Sri Lanka?
How did I end up in Sri Lanka? That's a very good question. I mean, it really was like how the film, how I explained the film. I saw the garden in a book. And,
Really?
I saw the garden in a book in the library at the AA, and I just couldn't understand that place. It was just like, what is this place? I've never seen a place like this. It looks like Italy, but it's in the middle of a jungle. It has bits of, modernist bits, but it's also got classical statues. It's like, nobody's taught me about this kind of architecture or this kind of landscape. Why has nobody ever told me about this? Why aren't we studying this? It just didn't make sense that this extraordinary place was not part of what I had been taught. You have to remember this is before the internet. So that planted a seed in my brain, which I couldn't follow up for many, many years, but eventually I did. Eventually I made a conscious decision to travel to Sri Lanka and to find the garden, more as like a tourist, really. I thought, well, that sounds an amazing place to go, so let's go. And then slowly the project developed that I have to tell this story of this place and this architect, and the garden is incredibly cinematic. For me, you're interested in landscape, so for me it's so cinematic, it's so sequential, it was really about bringing space and film together. The garden, that's what the garden does for me. So that's how I ended up in Sri Lanka.
And then you would return there?
Yes, so I would return that's kind of more for personal reasons why I'd return. Because I go there and do yoga and Ayurveda and so on, and it just happens to be in Sri Lanka. Geoffrey Bawa stuff just happens to be there. So that was one of the reasons why I keep going back. But I guess it was also it also pulled me back, But there's also a reason why this place, which is a place where you can kind of reconnect physically, physically recover. There must be certain other magnetic forces. It's interesting that it's not just purely that garden that draws you there, but that there's other magnetic forces of that place. Well, I think that the thing that drew me to the work of Geoffrey Bawa is the fact that he was making work that nobody else was. Really, that's what it was, and
how would you describe that work? What was he making that no one else was making?
He's a modernist, but very much situated in place. So, simply put, he's you could frame him under critical regionalism. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't really even fit in that, I think, because it's such a mix of styles. Vernacular, modernist, personal. He's really of a time and of a place. So he is a vision of the world that no longer exists and will never be again. And not only talks about a locality, but really talks about a moment in time that he is able to capture in his architecture. And what I mean by that is that he was Sri Lankan, but he was the son of part of his family were colonial Dutch settlers, so people who settled in Sri Lanka. And part of his family were Arabs who also came to Sri Lanka. So he was half Muslim, half Catholic. He was a total mix of cultures, which is what actually in Sri Lanka that is not unusual because of this tiny island. Many people kind of pass through over hundreds of years. So it's a total mix of cultures and always has been. But at the same time, he was the colonizer, but at the same time he was also being colonized by the English. So all of these things, him having studied in Europe, having a very privileged background, but having a deep understanding of his culture because he was Sri Lankan. So those two things coming together is a very, very unique kind of mix of influences and understanding of architecture, of who you are, of what you want to make. So, but most importantly to me, I just thought, why aren't people being taught this work? Like, why don't people know about it? And even today, when I show the film, like when I showed it here in New York, so many people said to me, I never heard of him, I don't know who he is, and particularly young people.
I think it's also, I saw the work when it was premiered in London, at London Film Festival, actually. There's so many people there from the AA. It was a wonderful moment. I guess one thing that I thought was magnificent in this work is kind of the embeddedness of the green. And it felt like the building was of this. It felt like it grew out of this greenery. It's such climate, I guess. The vegetation is so intense and it's so much part of there is like a sense of blur between the site and the building. And I don't know, is that something that was very present?
So it's the tropical climate allows him to, everything was open. Often there are no doors of any kind, inside and outside. It's like a completely open environment. And what one of his collaborators said in the film, which I thought was very beautiful, is that Bauer designed his houses like he designed gardens. So he was actually designing gardens. He was just using building materials.
Was that quote in the film?
Yeah.
Oh, it was, okay.
Yeah. So he was interested in landscape, and he used those principles and those ideas to design his architecture. So in that sense, you could say that that's unique, right? So you could argue that all his buildings are landscapes, except they use building materials.
And was it challenging as a filmmaker to draw certain boundaries, or to kind of to capture maybe the threshold?
One of the things, like you talk about this embeddedness, what I tried to do is not only that the buildings are embedded in the landscape, but that his architecture is embedded in Sri Lanka. So it's like everything, because Sri Lanka is so luscious and tropical and so on. So I saw no division between what was Geoffrey Bauer and what wasn't Geoffrey Bauer. So the journey is taken, so the greenness and the kind of landscapes of Sri Lanka that we travel through become really part of the landscapes that he designed too. So, and I have a quote on that at the very end. His garden is a garden within a garden, which is Sri Lanka. So no, not really. I enjoyed that kind of lack of threshold, and I thought it was great way. Sometimes we would walk through a corridor in a building, we didn't know whether we were on a cliffside. or something. You know, and I try to exaggerate that too. You know, make
because I do remember shots, and this is now my memory here also, which is also maybe interesting. But I do remember shots of like tops of treetops, or like kind of forest. Or am I?
Yes, there are shots.
So there
like
is
that.
there is a sense that, and I wonder whether were those shots from the tops of buildings, or were they shots to kind of capture this vast?
So we try to shoot everything in a way that as a person would be able to see it. So we don't use any drones, and we do very few, very wide establishing shots, because we try to show the experience of how you approach a building, like a person would approach a building. I think the shots that you're talking about were just, we were very high up somewhere in the landscape. Mm-hmm. We had climbed up somewhere so that we could have a view of,
of that dense.
Of that crazy, dense,
tropical.
Vegetation,
mm-hmm.
which actually is very vicious. And if we had any struggles while we were filming, it was to do with the humidity and the heat. A lot of the equipment kind of fell apart because it just couldn't handle the conditions that we were in.
And so I think what's interesting what you said earlier about a film about architecture, or that you want to create work that, you know, and I know that you have some other projects that are work in progress, mm-hmm. and so on. I wonder whether you ever think about film as architecture, whether you ever think about architecture as subject versus architecture as almost like a method, or is film a kind of a form of space making?
Yes, is the answer to that question.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what's fun for me, is
so you are both
spaces.
Interested in architecture as a subject as well as a kind of method, almost.
Yeah. So I'm not quite sure if I understand the question of method, but I'm interested in spaces as subjects, and capturing those atmospheres and recreating those atmospheres through the language of film for audiences to see. You know, I made another film about Jon Utzon's house in Mallorca, Canlis, and that is different to Bauer's Garden insofar that we're only in one location, which is this fairly small house, throughout the entire film. And I co-directed that with two other colleagues, Christopher Fischlein and Marie Ramsing, both of which are Danish. And I don't think that anybody else would make a film about Canlis like that. Mm-hmm. And the fun of making that film is about capturing a sense of space, creating an architecture through film, which is based on Canlis, but other people will make other films about Canlis, which are different. So this is a particular construction which is inspired and takes into account the atmosphere and the qualities of Canlis to construct something different.
I guess my question, and I actually think it's a very important question, is the one of, I mean, we said, and you said at the beginning of the conversation, that film is inherently architectural medium. But then when it's in addition about architecture, there must be some other degree of attentiveness to space that is being created. And I guess wondered, how do you exercise that attentiveness?
So the tricky thing for me is always, how much do I tell about the architecture? So in Bauer's Garden, we have a series of interviews and people that we speak to who tell us about Jeffrey, who tell us about the buildings, who tell us about his philosophy, whatever. So my concern, or kind of my question, is always, how much of that do I include in the film? And how much do I not include and just allow the audience to make up their own interpretation of the space? And that's always a very, very difficult thing. I find that's the hardest thing I find. Because in some ways, I'd rather not have any interviews and just allow the spaces to talk for themselves. But then I love to hear the stories too. you know, and I think the stories add to the subject. So on the one hand, I am constructing a spatial, you know, a space, but I'm also wanting to include the voices that add to that space. So in that sense, it's different to architecture, because architecture has no voice. In other words, you enter a building and you're there.
But I guess you can mislead. You know, you can mislead a viewer in film. You can show a sequence of spaces that isn't a true sequence of spaces, and you can in some way re-narrate the space. Have you ever done that, or do you do that, or are you really aware? When you're making a documentary, are you trying to not be misleading, or are you sometimes allowing yourself to be, or have you noticed in your work moments where you realize, oh, that's misleading, but I like it?
It depends on what I'm doing. When we were doing the film in Canlis and we were entering the house, because we never show an establishing shot of the house or a drone shot or anything like that, so you don't actually, if you've never been there, you don't actually know which is the way through. So we were trying very carefully to go through, and the sounds, the way we were designing the sound was to kind of really guide a true sequence of spaces. But in the end, I don't think that's really important. Mm-hmm. Because I don't think that it doesn't really matter what the sequence, I don't think you need to be so dogmatic about following a particular sequence. It's more about how the entire thing creates a sense of the place of the architecture. I think that's more important than a true kind of sequence of the building.
And so is film your primary medium now? Is this how you...
So ideally I would only make films. That's what I would like to do professionally. But yeah, I'm working on it. I'm teaching and I teach film in various schools. And I'm also interested, as you know, I'm also interested in looking at other mediums, so starting looking at virtual reality, you know, other mediums that look at space and sequence and narrative and so on. Yeah, because it's just a different language, and I'm kind of interested in.
Well, I think one thing we haven't mentioned, like a word we haven't really used so much, is the word time. Mm-hmm. And really, what you're doing, where you're interested in is, in some way, a time-based media. With your recent exploration of virtual reality, it's really about perhaps time as a thing. And I just wonder how maybe you think about time.
I only really think about time in the editing. And I never really think about time when I'm developing a script and when I'm doing the shots. And I don't think about it that much, actually. It was very interesting because I edit my own films, so I've watched them so much. And yesterday I saw Light Without Sun, which is the film about Canlis, in its entirety because I screened it. And one thing that spoke to me was just the timing. I thought was really good. You know, I edit them to such a degree that I really can't watch them anymore. But I had to sit through this screening, and I was thinking, actually, the time works very well in this film. So I don't think about it very, very consciously, but it's obviously something that I'm working with, you know.
But it's not like a theoretical...
No, not really.
...thing.
I mean, it's more a kind of emotional thing insofar that if the film requires to be slow, or if the cut requires to be fast, it's a reflection of the architecture in the space. That's about it.
What's really interesting is that you know about my research projects that I've mentioned in a number of my conversations to different people, so I don't need to tell you. I mean, you know about it, so I don't need to kind of explain it. But as part of it, I spoke to Kenneth Frampton, and Kenneth actually is, in our conversation, I must have asked something about film, or how he thinks about film, or time. And actually what he said, which I found really interesting, I think I was just poking him a little bit. I just wanted to see if there is if he's been thinking about film, because I also teach film and have keen interest, and also recently been making a film. But what Kenneth Frampton said is that film is probably the closest art form to architecture because of a sheer amount of complexity that it weaves together. And I just think that there's something really interesting in that it is a complex medium, like very multifaceted. It's a bit like a Rubik's Cube of a medium, just like architecture. And have you ever noticed that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's absolutely true. From a practical point of view, when you're involved in the design and building of a space, and when you are involved in the design and the building of a film, there are many, many processes which are very similar, from raising the money to the sheer cost of things and the amount of time it takes to make, and the amount of people involved. So it's incredibly complex. The amount of specializations that are involved in making something of a particular size. In Light Without Sun, we interviewed Juhani Palasma, and he has a very nice quote where he talks about architecture being understood as the discipline of space, but in fact, architecture really is also about the discipline of time.
Duration, almost.
How you design for time in architecture. So yes, they have incredible similarities, and at the end of the day, we are both in architecture and in film creating places for people to inhabit, whether it's in a film or whether it's in a building.
Whether it's physical or in your mind.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And those are the things that Pascal often said. There's no difference between what is in your mind, the spaces you construct in your memory and the spaces that are real. The two things are.
And also the most beautiful thing is when they blend, when there is this crossover and you don't really know.
Yeah.
And you've recently made this move from Europe to America.
Yeah.
Do you think this is impacting your practice?
No.
No?
Not at all. Not at all. I think maybe.
American filmmaking is very different to European filmmaking in many ways.
I guess so, and I'm slowly kind of seeing what kind of work is happening here. I guess what is maybe impacting me more is New York. Being in New York as a city, and just looking at that narratively. I'd love to make a film about New York somehow, but.
You arrived to New York from London, which is a kind of comparable metropolis in Europe on the other side of the Atlantic. Nevertheless, New York is quite different.
Totally different. Completely different. Yeah. The thing about New York is it's been on film so much. So that impacts or impacts me, because I turn around and I think, oh, I've seen that before. So it's a city which has already been digested before I came here. I already had digested it.
But it makes it interesting, for sure.
Of course, yeah, it makes it totally interesting, and yeah, I'm still getting my head around it. But so it hasn't really impacted my practice, but I love being in the city. Much more, I guess the city has impacted me more cinematically than London has impacted me cinematically.
My students, as we walk around the city, they keep pointing at things and say how many times they've seen that thing being destroyed in all sorts of like Marvel films that they watch. They're like, that's the thing that always gets destroyed first. Like Brooklyn Bridge just explodes.
That's true. So in that sense, it's a very odd city, because everyone feels it's their city somehow because they've seen it.
But so it might there might be something in your practice that will
It might do.
emerge or
with
evolve.
time. With
But
time.
you're also teaching. You're with the students. You're looking at sites. You're looking at
That's
different
right.
locations, and you're.
That's right. That's right. So, different schools, I'm looking at different aspects. So, at Barnard and Columbia, I'm doing my more kind of modernist architecture.
At Columbia.
Yeah, and buildings, as opposed to here at Pratt. We're looking more at neighborhoods, so we're looking at this kind of industrial neighborhood.
And at Harvard, you were also looking at
Harvard,
buildings.
we were doing a mix, really. Some people were looking at China, like a particular neighborhood, and some people were looking at specific buildings. So that was a little bit less defined. But as I developed that class, I'm thinking more history in relationship to buildings and archives and